Welcome, everybody. That was the sound of Atlas by Battles, a wonderful song. Possibly the most predictable one for James and Oliver I could have chosen. This is Chart Chat. It's not Chit Chat, it's Chart Chat. And I think that's the first time I've got that right in all my months of hosting this. So finally, we got it right. What is this? Well, this show came about from the conversations and arguments that Jeff, Steve, and I had while authoring and producing the big book of dashboards, as we argued and debated every axis, every pie slice, every bubble size, and every length of bar. We realized that those conversations were actually really engaging, and we wanted to bring them to the world with you and bring along some more hosts and guests too. So that's the purpose of the next hour, is to debate and discuss about the really geeky and fun side of data visualization, and this month, cartography. You are encouraged to engage and disagree, agree, but generally just use the chat, and we'll talk about the after party as well in a moment. So please, we're all here to look at the chat and hear what you want to say, as well as listen to our guests. And it's a special episode. Again, we've had some wonderful guests in the last few months. So I'll introduce the guests in a moment, but first, the four of us. My name's Andy Cotgreave, technical evangelist at Tableau, also host of If Data Could Talk. And I've been at Tableau forever, since 2011. That'll do for me. Jeff, hi. Say hi.
Hello, everyone. Jeff Shaffer here, Chief Operating Officer for Unifund in Cincinnati, Ohio. Andy's definition of forever. I'm at 26 years, 1996. Wow. Also adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati, where I teach data visualization and been there 10 years. Steve.
Hey, I am Steve Wexler. I am the founder, principal, sole employee at Data Revelations, along with Andy and Jeff. I am one of the three authors of the Big Book of Dashboards and also the author of The Big Picture, and delighted to be here with you today. And let me introduce our final co-host, Amanda Makulec.
Hi there, I'm Amanda Makulec. I am the Executive Director for the Data Visualization Society and also work as the Data Viz lead at Excella, based here in Washington, D.C. Back over to you, Andy.
All right, thank you very much. We'll come on to our guests. I'll let them introduce themselves in a moment. Our agenda for the day is fivefold. We're going to have fish, Cambodia, genius, vomit, and ice. And if you want to know a little bit more than that context, then stick around for the next hour to understand what these are all about. Right, so I'm going to stop my share now, and I'm going to welcome the guests. I'll just start with you, James. James, can you give a brief introduction and tell us what is the Atlas of the Invisible and why did the two of you write it?
Hi, thanks.
Hi, James.
Andy, for the introduction. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Normally I insist on Maps by Maroon 5 as my intro music, but Atlas is by Battles is fine. The Atlas of the Invisible then is about kind of the new ways we can see the world through data, I guess. And Oliver and I have been working together now for the best part of a decade, creating maps and data visualizations. And as I guess we'll discuss throughout the day, the afternoon, he and I have kind of different sets of skills that are very much complementary to one another in the way that we approach our work. So for this book, we really set about trying to harness, I guess, the power, the value of big and innovative data sets to tell us kind of new and compelling stories about, who we are and about the planet. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about our process a bit more and answer any questions you guys and the people who are listening along may have.
Fantastic. Okay, so Oliver, you're going to go first, I think, with Caught at Sea. No, we're going to talk about bombing in Cambodia first. So I think, Oliver, if you want to introduce yourself as we go into that, but just for everybody attending, everybody viewing, do use the chat. But I forgot to mention that after about 50 minutes to an hour, we're going to open the mic to you and do the after party, so that if you want to share your opinions or ask James and Oliver any questions, that will be a chance to do that on the mic if you wish. So Oliver, I guess our first one was going to be about Cambodia. So do you want to start the ball rolling and tell us a little bit about the process of one of these maps?
Yeah, James, are you able to share the images? This is a story that James found the data on. He found this incredible military data set that logged the thousands and thousands of bombing sorties flown by U.S. Air Force and its allies during the Vietnam War. And as we dug into it, we started to learn more and more about the history of the Vietnam War, or the hidden history. And this seemed like a good story to include in Atlas of the Invisible, because it was a data set about things that have been deliberately hidden from view. So what many Americans and many people around the world, except those living in the countries of Southeast Asia, didn't know was that the Nixon administration was actually leading a covert bombing operation across the border in Cambodia and Laos. And that data came to light to the rest of the world when President Clinton declassified the data at the start of the 21st century as a humanitarian gesture, because many of the bombs were cluster bombs, and many of those little bomblets didn't explode upon impact. And to this day, farmers going out with farm equipment, children playing in the fields and forests are coming across, scrap collectors with metal detectors are coming across this unexploded ordnance and either suffering injury or death as a result. And by declassifying this data, they're able to, the Cambodian government of Laos, government of Vietnam, have been able to go out 1 square meter at a time and de-mine essentially the landscape. So we wanted to bring that story to light because we didn't know about it before digging through this data. And it became a question of scale, cartographic scale, because there's a regional view where you're looking at, the 3 countries of Southeast Asia. And then we wanted to look closer on Cambodia and the military efforts crossing the border there, and what was happening at different phases of the war. And then we wanted to zoom in even closer to the local scale, the Battle of Khe Sanh, which to date is still the largest bombardment in military history. So it became this real cartographic and design puzzle of how do we pace out these 3 scales? Is it all in 1 spread? Is it 3 maps? How do we organize it? And the solution came in the form of a gatefold, where we were able to kind of control the reader's experience and the level of zoom of first on the flap of the gatefold, seeing the regional view, then opening up to the Cambodia view, and then turning the gatefold over to zoom into the local scale.
So for those, obviously, I don't know whoever has the book at home, some of you will, but yeah, the gatefold, the physical aspect of the book is an important part of the reader experience. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's even instances that I know you love, Andy, where we have you physically turn the book to do sort of the centerfold effect, where if we really want to show off a data set, or say a fuller projection, which has this beautiful connection of all the world's continents, rather than kind of cramming that in onto one right-hand page, we take up the whole spread, but force you as the reader to, or not force you, give you the opportunity to turn the book and see the world in greater scale.
Yeah, that was amazing. The gatefolds throughout the book really add to that sort of physical and visceral experience of the book. And there is a bunch of, you describe them as Easter eggs, I guess, in the maps, some of which exist on here. Would one of you like to talk about those?
Yeah, James, the base map was a sort of unexpected surprise when you sent that over to me.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. I'm having some technical problems here. My Zoom keeps crashing and restarting, so I'm jumping in and out a bit. So I'm just trying to get myself reorganized. Yeah, I mean, I did catch that question. So one of the things that we try and do in the work is kind of add little details that most people probably will miss, but if you're into maps and data viz, you might spot something, recognize something, and appreciate it. And one such example is in this this Cambodia-Vietnam graphic because it related to the bombing campaign and there's a lot of CIA intelligence. We thought, well, I thought, well, there must be some maps that the CIA created at the time that we could perhaps use to reference the map that we're showing this kind of digitized data for. And the reason I thought that would be interesting is for two reasons. Firstly, obviously the region has changed quite a lot. So if you use a modern day base map, say a standard Google map or something on the region that was being bombed in, say, the 70s, then of course it doesn't line up. And then we wanted to give something kind of the look and the feel of a map of that era. So there's two things we did. The first was actually source Landsat data, so satellite data that was actually around at the time, and use that to delimit the urban areas. So the extent of the cities and things like that are in the map that we created are the extents of the cities that were present during the time of the war. And then the second thing we did was actually get hold of a CIA terrain map. So the CIA has this fantastic archive of digital terrain maps and various other things, all hand done. This was georeferenced, so this was kind of aligned correctly to the Earth's surface, and then we could use that to fill in the base map. So this is what you see here in our map of the full region. So it looks, considering the thing was done by hand, it's extraordinary how well it all lined up. And, there's a few things we had to go in there and clean up. But again, it's kind of a nice, a thing that's nice to know, and a nice touch, I think, that combines some of these kind of data sets that are around at the time with this more kind of, modern electronic mapping that we do.
I think it's an interesting point that you raised, James, about the process piece and how these different layers came together, kind of blending a historical view with these other pieces. And I know because we have a lot of data viz folks who join us, some of whom are maybe more familiar with cartographic tools, some less so. Can you talk through the kind of tools and tech components that went into actually building this really, if you don't have the book is just, stunningly beautiful and really striking, and has a lot of information packed in like individual pages or views. So if you could speak a bit to that tech piece, I think it would be really interesting for a lot of us who maybe are a bit less familiar with how these kind of visuals come together.
Yeah, so I think the overall ambition here is to make it look like the maps have not been created by a computer. I think that's probably how I would view it. So one of the great things I love is, buying old atlases, looking through old maps and atlases. I've got loads on the wall behind me where these things are handcrafted, hand drafted, and, they're just, as items on their own, they're just visually really stunning. And I think, software often is a restriction for us. There's certain things we can't do, certain map projections we can't use, or certain ways of representing data, we feel limited by. And so, it's only through working with someone like Oliver that we can kind of truly break out of some of this stuff by bringing in the design elements. But the back end to that is still very much kind of tech driven. So in terms of how the data are stored, it's generally kind of a spatial data formats, geo packages, Postgres, SQL databases. We often use SQL databases. And then in order to kind of get that data kind of formatted in a useful way, we might interface it to R. So I use R quite a lot for the data formatting and the initial visuals, QGIS for the mapping, and also some ArcGIS as well. And then, there may be other sort of slightly more obscure packages and things. I'm not much of a Python user. I know that Python's big in data science, but that's not something I've kind of come up through. So as you'll realize, there's actually quite a lot of different packages I'm using, and that's generally driven by the format that the data come in, and certain things are better than others. So over the years, I've learned the strengths of certain packages, and I try and do a bit of everything. And then I generally export everything as a PDF, in a vector PDF format, so that we have the full resolution. And then clean it up a little bit in Illustrator, but then that's really where I pass the baton over to Oliver, who then picks up working in Illustrator and InDesign and things like that. But really my objective on the data side is to create these exports in a format that is as efficient and optimal as possible, so that we're not just I'm not just chucking stuff over to Oliver and it's like crashing Illustrator or InDesign or something like that. So yeah, and that's generally the main process. So in the case of this specific Cambodia map, I think that went through SQ, kind of in a MySQL database. It may have been that then went into ArcGIS, which had a whole lot of queries run on it, and then finally out into Illustrator that way.
So Oliver, tell us then. So James does the cartography. Then what do you then do? And the way James has just described it, it sounds like he does his work and then you do your work. And I know that's entirely not how it works, is it? But so what do you add, and then how do you do the circular, and how do you become greater than the sum of the two parts?
Yeah, exactly. In broad strokes, there's a before and after, but that's not really in the life of an individual graphic how it goes. That before and after is a constant cycle that happens multiple times over the life of a single graphic. And that's one of the strengths really of our partnership, is that we see each other as equals. I'm not just the decorator who comes in at the end and puts on some colors and labels. We're trying to optimize any given projection, every given layout for the form of the book that is a rectangle essentially. And there's other things that have to go on there. There's page numbers, there's footers, there's the body text, the headline, and there's an order in which I want a reader's eye to move across the page and organize all that information. And so, from the get-go, if we have a topic that we're interested in, go out and we search for the data. Then once we sift through the data, we find the angle the story we want to tell. And then it's only then that we start exploring the appropriate form. And at that point, James will do some initial plots. He'll export them to me, and I'll immediately take them into layout, and we'll just do a proof of concept to make sure the layout, the way we fill this rectangle corner to corner, is going to work. I was initially trained as a painter, and so I think of every book spread as just like a rectangle on the wall, and you have to create a composition corner to corner. And I want the whole thing to hold together with some integrity. I don't want a bunch of different pieces that can all just fall apart and fall off the wall. I want the whole thing to fit. So we test that out early on before we spend hours and hours polishing and cleaning and refining. We just get the basic, just like you're wireframing out a website. If you're doing web design, we essentially wireframe out every layout. And then it goes into all the color palettes and font style sheets.
Are you spending most of your time in Illustrator and InDesign? Or are there, in the same way that James had a variety of different tools he was using to eventually produce the PDF and get the image in a vector format, what is your suite of things that you're using to create this stuff?
Yeah, so all the book layouts are in InDesign, and then I'll have Illustrator for the individual graphic files. If there's a complex base map, like the CIA map, that will be initially laid in, with a Photoshop, TIFF file underneath. But ultimately, once everything's been set, not going to be any more changes. A lot of that base map Illustrator layers I'll bring into Photoshop and merge with the base map. So all base map material is all merged into one flattened TIFF that then goes to the printer and laid down underneath So at the point that goes to press, usually the Illustrator file is only like labels and keys and things like that. Like all the base map stuff at that point has been flattened into a TIFF file. For that Battle of Khe Sanh map, where I got those cloud effects because I needed some place to focus your eye in, because the bombing extends way off of the spread. I wanted to focus your eye in right on the Khe Sanh military base area, and we also needed a place on all that complex bombing data to put our captions. I came up with this idea based off of a 19th century map that James found to kind of take the God's eye or pilot's eye view, looking down through the clouds, and I painted in the cloud effects in Photoshop. And at that point, it was like this layering thing where if I did the clouds on the base map, but left all the bombing data in Illustrator, then all of the symbols would be on top of the cloud. So I waited until that last minute when we knew everything was set, and then merged all the bombing data into my TIFF and then could put the clouds on top.
I'm just loving even the language you're using around just like painting in clouds and things that I think we don't always think about when we're talking about data visualization and these kind of cross-functional teams, and the benefit that we get from bringing people in who have very not computer science or technical analytics backgrounds, because I think you end up with these things that are these kind of productions and these kind of books that are so engaging and interesting. I mean, we had a chat on our Nightingale blog today for DVS talking about the value of bringing in the humanities into data viz and the value a poet can bring to your data viz team. And you just
Absolutely.
think differently. And I love the language that you use to describe your process. It's just very refreshing.
Well, I find analogies across, between genres, between music, poetry, story, novel, storytelling, whatever it is. Like, I'm always looking for analogies that I can bring in as like using metaphor and other things that people are already familiar with as a way into a thorny data set. One, for us, if we're trying to figure out what the story is, but also for a reader to like help them understand what we're talking about immediately.
James, so I feel like in the field of data visualization, it feels like we've sort of saddled ourselves with it being it's a science and it's all scientific. But I guess cartographers have known this art and science truth for centuries. Would that be right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I often talk about kind of the fundamental challenge of maps, which is, of course, that the world is an infinitely complex place, and you can't capture that complexity on any single computer screen or piece of paper or anything like that. And so what you have to do is take a whole series of decisions about how you represent the world, what you're going to show and how you're going to show it. And the presumption, of course, is that those decisions are made purely impartially, and that there is an impartial logic behind them, and what you're showing is fact. And of course, it's not always fact, or at least there are some things that you leave out and other things you leave in. And that flexibility, you might think about the distortions of the world through different map projections or what parts of a data set you focus on. That's really where we can bring in the narrative. And I think a lot of the conversations I have, presenting this work to academic audiences is, oh, well, you're kind of dumbing stuff down here. What you're doing is you're oversimplifying something that's complicated, or, you can't expect us to use the idea of some kind of narrative device or even, put clouds around something to enable the focus area. And my pushback on that is, well, of course you can, because actually everything we're doing here is it's robust and it's true to the data set. But what you're doing is you're helping the viewer or the reader of the data set understand what's going on. And, in our case, we're trying to reach as broader audience as possible. But you might be trying to reach sort of a scientific audience through peer review and that kind of thing, in which case you can still point reviewers to particular parts of your graphic and provide focus, or you're presenting results to stakeholders or team members or something like that, in which case the same devices come through. And I think, that the one thing that I suppose Oliver and I have that makes our lives a little bit easier is often we're only having to do things once or twice over, right? So once we've created a process for doing something, it goes over, we can share it with set down on the page, and there can be a lot of manual work to make it look as good as it is. And I understand that actually in most contexts, you're generating reports that may be duplicated many times over or something like that. And so that's where you have to, or working at real speed. And I think that that's where the real kind of trick is, finding that balance between stuff that you can automate and just kind of churn out and that's compelling versus stuff that takes a little bit more time. I mean, I think my reference for that is the guys at the Financial Times, I think, have done that incredibly well. I know a lot of their visuals are quite automated, scripted in the way they use R, but actually they still have this kind of can very rapidly create like a strong narrative behind what they're showing.
But even in the design of a report, you may have your efficient, streamlined style guide of how dashboards and sidebar charts and things will look, and they can be really like clean and consistent. But you might build up to then like a center spread that really has the drama and tells like the main story of the whole report, and like then that's like a bespoke centerpiece that you can put some of that creative energy in. It's like choosing your battles.
Brilliant. Let's move on to the Caught at Sea chart, because I think in there we can talk a little bit about some of the the nitty-gritty design choices, sort of color and projections. So Oliver, do you want to?
We'll start with the projections, James.
Yep.
Yeah. So this is a good example of how when we're trying to tell a story, form is the last step of our process. Here we have this data set we came across about illegal fishing, fishing hours logged by Global Fishing Watch. And as we started digging through their report, we realized that depending on the type of fishing method being used, there were clear geographic regional patterns. So like long line fishing boats, which trail these, very, very sometimes kilometers long lines of hooks, baited hooks behind them. They're mostly operating on the high seas, way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and in some other equatorial regions. And then squid jigging, where they're like operating at night, sending these hooks up and down to lure squids out of the upwelling waters. But that's often happening off the coast of South America. And then a lot of trawling is happening around the continental shelves off of Europe. And when we saw those regional patterns, we thought, well, one map probably isn't appropriate here. What if we had, similar with the bombing in Southeast Asia, what if we had a series of maps, each one focusing on a different fishing method? And so let's pick forms that are optimized for the regions of the world we're trying to share. So we led with the long line fishing method and went with this Spillhouse projection made by a guy named Appleton Spillhouse. That's down in the center of this slide, where you've got two hemispheres, and the continents get distorted, but it allows us to show our oceans in a contiguous manner. So if we click over to the first spread, you can see how the first spread looked. And so all the color there is showing the fishing hours, and then the green areas are showing marine protected area or exclusive economic zones that belong to each nation or territory. And so a lot of the fishing activity is happening outside of these exclusive economic zones. And then when we wanted to zoom in on the squid off of South America and the trawlers off of Europe, on the next spread, we picked this sort of global curved arrangement, and then another form here was iconic, James.
Yeah, that's the European azimuthal projection. So yeah, it's a more kind of, it's the standard projection that you see of maps of Europe.
Yeah.
As you can
And-
see, I'm not the expert in the names of all the different projections, but I often, say to James, like, is there some way we could just show Europe coming in from the corner, and then, he tells me what the appropriate projection would be for that.
Galen in the comments is saying he started his data viz with a master's project on historical fishing patterns off the coasts of Maine and Massachusetts. So he is loving seeing what's happened in seeing modern applications of this. There's something about the color palette on this as well. Where did you get the inspiration for the color palette?
Yeah, so the inspiration because we have so many different forms across the book, I wanted a few things that connected across the entire book that, tied everything together. So it all looked like it was coming out of the same shop. And I took the inspiration for the book's overall color palette from Los Angeles, where I live, where there's a lot of, bright colors, magenta flowers and things like that. But then on individual graphics, choosing which of those colors from the color palette to apply to any one graphic, for me was always a non-arbitrary choice. I'm always looking for ways to help a reader connect with the subject at hand. And if I can use colors from my color palette that relate to the subject matter, I'm always going to do that to try and reinforce the message that we're trying to show. So, a couple of examples here. A map about fishing. I looked at a fish on our map of the Battle of Quezon and the bombings of Southeast Asia. Like, I had to have all these different explosions happening against the green vegetation forests of Southeast Asia. And green is actually a pretty hard background to work with when you want to show like a lot of different highlight colors. So I was having a real hard time finding colors that were distinct enough and light enough, because we print everything with for production reasons internationally. We only use black ink for all of our labels. So all the color had to be light enough to have black labels work on top of it. I was walking my dog and saw these flowers in a neighbor's garden. I thought that's exactly what I need to do for this bombing map. And then for a map on historic shipping, where we're showing shipping in the age of sail, age of steam, and the age of diesel, found the solution right under my nose on my favorite flannel shirt.
Fantastic. Jeff, do you have a question?
Yeah, well, you just mentioned the black text. That's one of the constraints I guess you were under. What other constraints did you have, working with the book, and how did that affect, your design choices throughout what you were doing, like the black text? I mean, that means you can't use a dark background in many cases, or you have to make other design compromises.
Yeah, that's something we discovered on our second book, because our first book was all about London, and we didn't expect it to be translated. And to be honest, we weren't even really thinking about it. We were just focused on getting the book done, and we were using reversed out type with dark backgrounds, which adds drama to a spread. We're using colored type, connect the label with the color key. And it was only when we started getting into Where the Animals Go that has this global scope that that our publisher was like, hey, if you want this book to be translated, it's too expensive for them to publish or to reproduce and translate all 4 color plates, CMYK on press, just keep all the text on the black layer. So that was a challenge. And one way to get around that is by expanding one's typographic palette. So by introducing a variety of fonts, that all play a certain role, whether it's in the body text, the headline, all the hydro labels, all the political labels. Like, I assign a role and build out a whole style sheet for all these different fonts. So even if they're all black and gray, the italics, the serifs, the sans serifs, all that stuff, your eye distinguishes between them, and you can sort through the hierarchy, even the colors all the same. Another big restraint often in a book that you don't have to deal with if you're doing digital dashboards is pesky gutter that cuts right through the middle of a graphic sometimes. And I, as much as possible, try and turn that gutter into an opportunity. It's a great tool if you want to compare and contrast something on the left side of a spread to something on the right side of the spread. You've got this this thing that's telling a reader this is different from this, and you can leverage that to help your reader understand what you're trying to do.
So like one of the other things is obviously we have constraints on how much we can fit on a page in terms of how many pixels the printer can print and the size and so on. And so there's a couple of examples here are good examples where we had things like gridded data. So this is the fishing example, but then these guys is just a little bit of a hint of some of the gridded shipping data we looked at. And they're good examples of where we're talking about that iterative process where we're going back and forth, where Oliver may come back and say, well, James, that grid is just never going to reproduce at that level, or your coastline is far too detailed to print, or all that kind of stuff. Can you create a larger grid or a more detailed coastline? And of course, when you're dealing with data, that can actually give you slightly different answers, particularly gridded data. Your counts can change depending on how big your grid is and all that kind of thing. So the form, i.e. the fact that we're printing this thing and we've got a certain size, is actually really integral to the way that I approach my work with the data. And that is really different, because normally someone like me just might churn out some graphics at any old resolution, and then we kind of assume that a designer is going to squeeze it into shape. But the only way we can really do this stuff effectively is by, as I say, bearing those things in mind and redoing things if necessary, just to ensure that, when they print, we're showing them in the best possible light.
How many? So how many iterations does a map typically go through? And how long does it take to do? And how do you know when you're done?
Well, I think we have good days and bad days, or good maps and bad maps. I think some seem effortless, whilst others may appear fairly straightforward on the face of it, but the result of thousands of small decisions and increments. So it kind of depends. I mean, I think one of the big breakthroughs, for example, on this on the Battle of Khe Sanh map, which I'll just show you here. I think the thing that we really struggled with, and this is one of the ones why we like talking, I guess, about these maps, is the sense of narrative and how you can push the narrative along through the data. And this one had multiple iterations of different size circles and colors and things like that. And a really important decision was ensuring that our color choices on this map and also our previous the previous example of all of Cambodia actually aligned with different phases in the mission. And so this is an example of where we might have pushed something along quite a long way to almost the end, where we think, well, we've done all we can with this, and you're looking at it and you're saying, still, there's not something's not quite working here for the reader. And in order to pull out the narrative, it meant effectively for me going back to the very beginning of my process and tweaking all the dials to get the stuff out at the end that we're interested in, and then the key narrative we're showing. And so I think that's kind of a really important lesson that I've learned over successive books and hundreds of maps, particularly working with Oliver, is sometimes you just have to say, right, this just isn't working. I know you've spent a long time on this, but you are just going to have to set it to one side for a few days and then see how it looks afterwards. And if it means going back to the beginning, then that's just what we're gonna have to do.
I mean,
Amanda,
looking at this, the map you just had up, even the legends in this book are just like a master class in legend design. Every single map, every single page that I looked at, the legends themselves, even going back to the one you had just shown, that instead of using a straight bubble, you have something that just has the little ticks to look like a target, or the little shapes that you use that look kind of like little airplanes, like in their own little diamondly ways. Mm-hmm. Or even on the diagrams you had on the fishing one, where you actually have a diagram, like a simple line diagram showing actually what it means to have these different kinds of fishing boats out there. I was just struck by all of those tiny little things that you pointed out are harder to do in like a reporting, dashboarding production environment. But where we can, those kind of small visual cues just seem really powerful. And so I'd be curious if you have any tips for folks as they're kind of approaching how to adopt any of these maybe slightly artistic approaches and creating these legends and these different encodings in their own work.
Yeah, so Andy Kirk talks about like the little of visualization, I think is the way he describes it, or instead of big data, the little. And I think that's what you're getting at, is like these keys, like literal keys to deciphering what you're looking at. And well, not literal, they're not actual keys. But when I'm working on these things, we often start with the big map, and it can be tempting to just leave the key to the end. It's just this obligatory thing. But once you start writing the text, and this is what James was getting at, with having to go back to the beginning and re-export the data, is once you start writing the narrative, you realize what the reader needs to understand the story you're telling. And the key is where they'll often go first. And so you can have a standard key where it's just like a bunch of color boxes, but like at least for me, I find that an idea will come to my mind of like, yeah, it'd be helpful to just show people what like a long line fishing boat looks like, or it would be helpful, like, what if these things are quick targets? And sometimes I'll suppress that idea because it's just like, that's a pain. I don't have time to do that right now. But I guess my advice would be to like indulge all those impulses of like what would help you. If you have an idea of like what would help you, that same thing is going to help any other reader who's coming to this cold and doesn't know any of the stuff that you know. So think about it like the generosity of data visualization, right? Being generous to your reader and helping them, giving them the those fun clues and touches.
That's excellent advice. Let's move on, because we're getting into the last 15 minutes of this section. And don't forget, everybody attending, you can join in, well, you can type questions in the chat. Actually, we've not been very good at sending the questions to James and Oliver, so I'll make sure I do that in the next few minutes. But we'll open the mic, and if you have comments or questions for James and Oliver, we would love you to do that. But we Steve, Jeff, and myself each chose one chart we'd love to know a little bit more about for our lightning round. I'm actually going to change the order because we were talking about keys. So the first one the one I wanted to mention, and then we'll come to Steve next, was the one about air turbulence. I don't know if you've got a slide of that one, James.
Yeah, sure.
Because this one has an interesting key.
Show the 3-step one first, James.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just hesitating on what the best approach was, but I'll do that now.
While you do it, Michael Terry shared Robert Frost's quote, "A poem is never finished, only abandoned." Needs no wonderful.
We've abandoned about 50% of our ideas in the creation of this book.
Are they the ones that are they in the book, or are they still in files on your desktop?
No, they were abandoned a long time ago. They never came close.
Right. Wow.
To the graph.
Yeah.
So this is a great example of, I think, what James and I do together as a geographer designer team. It's like we come across an interesting story in a scientific journal, and we might see like an initial plot of data. This is looking at projected turbulence 30 to 50 years hence as a result of climate change. And we start getting an idea for how it might work on the spread. Okay, it would be cool if we did, these globes. James, export the data to me, and it comes out, maybe with some a default color palette. And then we start thinking about like, well, what color, if we were going to apply our own colors to this, what color most symbolizes turbulence? And the idea that came to me was the puke emoji. So we went with that and went with a color palette that scales from like a stable gray and a little gray smiley face to a very queasy green.
And just a quick, this is a really great example of how we haven't actually, the bit I was talking to mentioned before about kind of academics or scientists or whatever analysts saying, oh, you're kind of dumbing down the idea that you're looking at. We haven't changed anything here. from this point to this point, there's very little difference in the way that the data is being represented in terms of the range of colors available, all that kind of stuff. All we've done is project it onto a globe to make it relatable as an airline map. And then we've just picked a different diverging color palette, which better represents the thing that we're thinking about, or gives a different angle. So it's, we're not talking necessarily a big thing, actually quite a small thing, like having the idea for the appropriate color choice can make quite an enormous difference in the way that a graphic's received and perceived by the people looking at it. Even in the title, right? Because you could have titled this page, Climate Models Predict More Turbulence, right? But you didn't. You made it more engaging as well. So Michael Terry asks a question, which I think is really interesting. Any tips for putting yourselves in the shoes of a naive reader when you yourselves have spent weeks looking at a map? So I think this is a challenge we have as dashboard designers. When you spent weeks looking at a map, you know every single pixel. So at some point you forget what it's like for me, the reader, coming to it fresh. How do you maintain that naive person's view and know that they're going to have a good experience?
Try writing about the text. Write the text. Like that's the second half of the job as a data visualizer, is doing the writing. Like a lot of people don't believe that we write our books, and that's something we take a lot of pride in, is like using the language and like everyday language, not academic ease, to efficiently, maybe in like 200 words or less, like get you into the story with a beginning, middle, and end. And one of the key sentences we often, like in our first drafts, leave out of the text is, in this map you see, or like on to the right you will see. And getting that back in is the key. It's like reminding someone that someone doesn't know all the stuff that you know. And if you step back and you say, in this map, or here you will see, then you're forced to, like, in a sentence, make sure that you can explain what someone's supposed to take away. And if you can't do that, there might be a problem with your initial export or your color palette, and then just like the text and the graphics start informing each other.
My advice would be, confront the graphic. So look at it and say, is this really telling me, or anyone looking at it, the story we want it to tell? And I think that's the one thing a lot of people are scared to do, because you just spent a week on it. It's your pride and joy, and the last thing you want to tell yourself is this thing isn't working. And invariably, the way that in academia, the world I live in, people justify that as they say, well, it looks complicated because it is complicated, and I'm not going to do anything more than that. And that really, getting past that, you kind of build up, your resilience to that kind of thing, because it's painful to start with. But once you get past that, that to me is the biggest thing. And then the second thing is, can I explain this to someone who has no interest whatsoever in what I'm trying to show, and can I convince them this is an interesting idea, and that they can take something away from this? I think Oliver and I, we've developed thick skins over the years with one another, in terms of, like, we have that back and forth a lot, and that really helps, I think, having a collaborator to push you on, because otherwise, you can be doing this in isolation.
Yeah, that's the wireframing and all that stuff, like testing everything as early as possible, so you don't get too far down the road and start becoming, like, clingy to your ideas.
Yeah.
Folks who have not read this book yet, and you should get this, it is not just a book of pictures. The essays that accompany each of the visualizations are fantastic. They're really well written. They're compelling. I learned a ton. I almost wanted to explore the bicycle ride share, because just the history behind it, and I can't remember, was it the Netherlands or Belgium, where the protest movement in the mid-60s, where all this stuff started from. I had no idea about this. I knew a lot about the secret bombing of Cambodia, but didn't know that there are still unexploded shells, and in some cases it will be another 5-10 years before they hope that's all cleaned up. So the essays are absolutely terrific. And yeah, a lot of the stuff deals with heavy stuff, but the bicycle ride shares, the visualization for that I thought was really fun and clever and playful. And Andy, should we transition to the
go to Genius.
Yes.
Yes.
Because I have two questions for Oliver about this, and I know the answer to the first question, and I'm very curious about the second one. So, Touched by Genius, I believe, is the title of this. So we're waiting in wild anticipation for it to appear. This
Amanda says, don't be fearful of the phrase essays from Steve. Yeah. Yes. Essays has kind of an academic connotation, doesn't it? It's as she says, they're nice, easy reads.
You could easily describe them as short stories as well. Very well written, thoughtful short stories.
I said touched by genius. Graced by genius is much better language. And there's the sunbeams emanating from the center here. But what we're seeing is a comparison of the lifespan of many wonderful artists that I guess the two of you greatly admire. That's the length of the orange or yellow, and where the little dot is the age when they produced a particularly noteworthy work. I don't know if it's necessarily the work that they're most famous for, but certainly a very noteworthy work. And I'm looking at this as someone who is getting fairly beyond in age, at least compared to everybody else on this call. I'm looking at, all right, let me look at the older people and see, when they, produce great work. So I'm going to ask the first question, what's coming, which is, well, why didn't you do this as a bar chart, and make it really easy, compare the heights of people's ages and when they produce their work. And then I do have a follow-up question, but I'll wait to hear from you first.
Sure. I mean, you could have done a bar chart, but I don't know how many readers would read a book of like 100 bar charts. So we're always looking for some visual diversity that is still appropriate for the data we're trying to share with you and the story we're trying to tell. And the second reason for this is that, again, I'm always looking for visual metaphors that underscore my message. And we're talking about genius here, this idea of inspiration, where ideas come from. And I've always loved this sculpture by Bernini, Ecstasy of St. Teresa. And there's just these golden rays cascading down on St. Teresa. And so I just thought, well, what if I had all of these bars radiating out like a sun? And again, we're leveraging the form of a book here, where you've got a gutter running right down the middle. And so, like, you can take advantage of the symmetry of two book pages by having this semicircle branching out.
And
can I add another defense? Something I've thought about a lot. I've never written this down. But charts often have a primary and a secondary story they're telling, right? And in this one, the genii are ordered in the age of their prime masterpiece, right? And so that, because you can see the black dots expanding outwards as you go, kind of in almost a golden spiral, it's actually really easy to decode that ascending gauge group. So that's the primary purpose of the data plot here. The secondary data plot is the length, which so I'd say what Oliver done is given a really nice used radial to encode the primary story very cleverly, and then the gist of the secondary data source, the secondary data point is available but less accurate.
James, can you click over to the lifelines image? Yeah. So this idea originally started from a graphic that I did for a TED Talk back in 2013. And at that time, I was looking not just at artists, but I was also looking at scientists, composers, and poets at the ages when they made their works. And, now that you have me talking about this more, Steve, there's another reason for not using a bar chart. And the idea is that at birth, we all kind of start off together, as these like untapped, beings, and who knows what path our lives are going to take. And then, as we know, we start finding our way in our teenage years, in our 20s, we start to distinguish ourselves. And so by using a radial orientation, I can have us all clustered together at birth. And then, our chosen disciplines of science, poetry, whatever, and the works we make, start to radiate out and spread out as we distinguish ourselves as we grow older. A bar chart, you wouldn't get that. You would have a ton of just like dead space in the first 20 years. And here I can kind of efficiently compact all that together.
Interesting. Andy, do we have time to move to the last one, or are we?
I think maybe not. If we can maybe bring it up in the next half hour section if necessary. But right, I think we are nearly at the top of the hour. So if you want to stick around and ask James and Oliver questions or bring your opinions, then stick around. If you have to go, then we wish you well. James, how can people find out more about you and your books?
If you go to atlasoftheinvisible.com, we've got the options of, basically where you can buy it. Those in the UK, don't panic if it says out of stock on Amazon. It kind of is, no. But I recommend I'd send you to Blackwell's instead, because they're selling it for the same price, and it's not feeding the beast that is Amazon. But perfect Christmas gift. So if you've got your last minute gift list, definitely put it on there.
Yeah, marvelous. And then links to the two of your social media accounts are on that page as well. So atlasoftheinvisible.com will get you there. So we now will do a slight transition. Before we do, we'll be back for Chart Chat in 2022. Flipping heck, how did it get to 2022? Thank you everybody for being with us this year, and we cannot wait to bring more guests and debate and argument and chart chat